I'm Kenneth Welsh. Welcome to Northern Mysteries. In the early 1970s, researchers in Toronto, Ontario, succeeded in creating an imaginary ghost named Philip. In pseudo-seances, these researchers would successfully reproduce all of the effects normally associated with manifestations from the hereafter, like knocks, floating objects, and answers to questions that the seance participants knew nothing about. Today, the experiment with Philip the Ghost remains the most significant in the history of parapsychology. An unusual experiment is about to be filmed in the studios of City TV in Toronto. The stars of this show are 8 people sitting around a table. Off to the side on a raised bench are 3 men observing the experiment. Reverend Lindsay King, psychologist Joelle Whitten, and Dr. George Owen, scientific director for the Toronto Society of Psychical Research. The studio director gives the signal that the experiment may begin. Participants lay their hands flat on the table and begin calling out a name.
Are you there, Philip? I want to see you, Philip.
Soon the table begins to rise, as if it had a life of its own, to the surprise of the participants. Shortly afterwards, it seems that Philip no longer wishes to remain in the middle of the room. As he heads toward Reverend King, the table moves with him. And the 8 mediums have a hard time keeping their hands in place. Once the table stops, one of the participants suggests to the clergyman that he say hello to Philip.
Hello, Philip.
The table rises in response. The only problem is that Philip doesn't exist and never did. Philip is an imaginary ghost. In the fall of 1972, Dr. George Owen, director of the Toronto Society of Psychical Research, came up with a unique experiment.
George
Owen was a mathematician and geneticist. He studied at Cambridge University in England. He also had an interest in poltergeists.
With the assistance of 3 men and 5 women, who had no particular gift for communicating with the spirit world, Dr. Owen conducted one of the most significant experiments in the field of parapsychology in the 20th century. They created Philip, the imaginary ghost.
Philip the Imaginary Ghost was an attempt by the Toronto Society for Psychical Research to prove that paranormal events could be created without the help of spirits from another plane.
Instead of assuming that all physical manifestations were caused by the spirits of the deceased, as spiritualists claimed, Dr. Owen sought a more natural explanation. He wanted to show that living beings, through some mechanism that has yet to be explained, could project their energy onto material objects.
Dr. Owen asked the group of 8, as they were called, to imagine the fictitious character with a name, age, gender, and nationality. They came up with Philip, a 30-year-old aristocratic Englishman living in the 17th century at Diddington Manor in Warwickshire, England. Then they invented Philip's life story. He had a wife, Dorothea, who was cold and frigid. He fell in love with Margot, a beautiful young gypsy. Dorothea discovered her husband's infidelity and accused Margot of witchcraft. Margot was condemned and burned at the stake. Heartbroken, Philip took his own life, jumping off the battlements of Diddington Manor. He was only 30 years old. Of all these biographical tidbits, Diddington Manor was the only element that was real. And of course, it had never had an occupant resembling Philip.
It took them several months before they had worked out the details of the character they were going to create. So it was 1973, I think, between 8 and 9 months later, that the experiments actually began.
They met on a weekly basis in a designated area of the society headquarters, which we called the Philip Room. And no, this room was not used for any other purpose. Had a card table with 8 metal chairs around it. And they met once a week for a period of well over 10 years.
Philip, are you there, Philip?
The group sat around in a circle with a picture of Philip in sort of a meditative state, trying to produce an apparition. And after a year, nothing happened. No phenomenon, no apparition.
Philip, we're looking for you. Philip, give us a sign, please.
At first, the members just developed a friendship with each other. They spent months together, with no occurrences of a psychokinetic or telekinetic nature. Then at some point, they changed their strategy. And suddenly, they began to see results, like raps on the table or under it. And the table began to shake and move. These were physical things that could be recorded.
Give us a sign, Philip. Philip, are you there, Philip?
Within a month or two of talking to this imaginary ghost, Philip, people started to get raps on the table. In turn, each person would say something like, "Good evening, Philip," "Hello, Philip," and there would be raps underneath their fingertips. Or if a visitor came in and identified himself and said, "Hello, Philip," there'd be a rap underneath the visitor's hand. These raps were audible, were tape recorded, and had a characteristic sound envelope. And we've published the results of that auditory study.
The tapping eventually led to the table being shaken, eventually moving, and eventually actually turning right on its side. Those were really the proofs that they had in fact accomplished their experiment.
Philip's manifestations were far from what they had hoped for, but still, the group would ask a question, and Philip would answer. Surprisingly enough, the answers always corresponded to his alleged biography. As the seances progressed, Philip became more enterprising. After a few raps on the table, he would raise it off the ground and make it dance on 2 or 3 legs.
We were very careful to try and avoid hoaxes. On several occasions, we had what are called doily nights, where we would put doilies, paper doilies, under the hands of the members. And if they tried pushing the table, the doilies would simply slide across the table. So clearly the table movements were not caused by anyone pushing it. And the cameras, when we had those opportunities to videotape it, it was clear that, say, 2 people sitting on opposite sides of the table, if they both lifted their knees, might lift the table up. It was clear that that was not happening either.
Philip, are you there, Philip?
Encouraged by the astounding results, other groups around the world tried the same experiment with other imaginary characters. The results were all basically the same.
They told themselves they had found the magic formula. A mix of spontaneity combined with weekly meetings and an experimental framework. They thought this was the secret to being able to produce this kind of phenomenon at will. But they realized that this strategy alone was not enough. It also took a lot of tenacity on the part of the members.
It would appear that the hereafter is not the only explanation for manifestations of so-called spirits. However, it's been nearly 30 years since the original Philip experiment, and parapsychologists are still just as puzzled now as they were back then as to what was producing these manifestations.
It is interesting that the scientific community has never followed the Philip experiment, or indeed many other experiments of a similar nature. Why, I can't answer. I myself am fully convinced that there is a level of psychic ability that is obtainable by us if we knew how to reach it. Also, let's face it, the scientific community is always a little behind the human experience. And I don't think it's any more profound than that, really.
Whether you approach this from the spiritualist angle or the parapsychological angle, it's impossible to come up with scientific proof, because that proof requires that you not only be able to observe the phenomena and reproduce them at will, you must also come up with a theory to explain the phenomena and predict when they will occur. So since that wasn't possible in this case, the matter is still not settled.
Although a lot of documentation has been written about Philip the Ghost, most people are unaware of this experiment. Rather than shedding light on the spiritual world, this experiment raises questions about our values and beliefs in the nature of man. Do we know even less about our minds than we do about the spiritual world? The German word poltergeist means knocking spirit. Experts believe that poltergeists are behind inexplicable manifestations like knocking on walls and furniture being moved around as if pushed by invisible hands. In 1989, in Beauport, Quebec, a house on Monseigneur Gauthier Boulevard became the stage for unusual occurrences caused by a poltergeist. And everything was caught on film, just like Philip the Ghost experiment. Was it really a knocking spirit? It was an August morning in 1989, and the skies were cloudy in the Quebec City suburb of Beauport. As young Nancy lay daydreaming in her bed, her mother finished making breakfast. Suddenly, a deafening noise above her head brought Nancy back to reality. A few seconds later, another noise. this time even more violent, shook her out of her reverie once and for all. A few centimeters from her bed was a hole in the wall. The teenager was terrified. The ride they'd been on for several weeks had just become too bumpy, and now the 4 tenants of the building knew that it was time to move out.
One has to remember that something special happened in Beauport near Quebec during the summer of 1989. It was to the effect that a house started to perform irregularly.
Precisely what's going on in this house.
Well, the wall is moving back and forth, just like that. And then it makes a kind of noise, like that. Oh, cow, it can't get any better than what you're seeing right now before your very eyes.
We were skeptical ourselves. We thought that someone was knocking from the other side, but the police bore witness to the fact that there was no one in the other apartment.
People living inside this house started to observe different strange phenomena. Of course, it scared the daylight out of them, and they started to look for answers. What the hell is happening?
Mrs. Godbout was the first one to hear a loud bang coming from the wall that separated her apartment from her neighbor's. The impact was so strong that the plaster was coming off the wall. Mrs. Godbout thought that Mrs. Cochran was responsible for the noise. In the 48 hours that followed the first bang, the residents of the dwelling on Monseigneur Gauthier Street heard 19 more. The house shook with the force of each one. Distraught, the tenants contacted the city of Beauport, and a building inspector was sent to their residence.
While I was there, one woman said to me, "It just happened again." Then she said, "Just wait, Mr. Dubé, and it'll happen again." She told me, "Place your shoulder against the wall and you'll get a taste of what it's like." I heard cracking sounds like pistols going off. And so I leaned my shoulder against the wall, and then all of a sudden it hit. I was struck so hard, I was really dumbfounded. I could attest that there was something abnormal going on in that house.
Within a few days, everyone's nerves were shattered in that building on Monseigneur Gauthier Street. Everyone was accusing their neighbor of being behind the disturbances. They all suspected each other and wouldn't believe anything their neighbors said. The tenants of the haunted house, as it was referred to by the neighborhood, were in dire need of assistance.
The firemen and the police were investigating everywhere, trying to find out what was going on in that house.
At first, it was proposed that gas might be leaking up from the ground and causing pressure on the structure of the dwelling. The Metropolitan Gas Company sent a technical team to perform an analysis.
While we were below, we heard a loud noise coming from upstairs, like a fist pounding on the wall. We went upstairs, but we didn't see anyone or anything. But we did finish our testing and effectively found no trace either of natural gas or of methane in the building.
A team of reporters from a local TV station who had heard of the case interviewed a geological engineer who thought that perhaps the clay soil was responsible for the shaking of the building.
The moving wall acts a little bit like a membrane, and when it moves, it's because there are jolts coming from the wall, not from the roof. This is what we call unequal settling. Because of a lack of precipitation, the soil dries out, thus causing the walls to put pressure on the membrane.
In the days following this report, the region had a lot of rainfall, but the situation didn't change. Also, if the ground had anything to do with these noises, why weren't any of the other houses in the neighborhood experiencing the same thing?
If the surrounding houses were not disturbed by this phenomena, one has to look at the year that the house was built, how the footing of the house was made compared to the other housing around the immediate area. And then you have also to dig into the soil. There could be a big rock underneath the house next to the one we're talking about, therefore having a completely different base.
When experts failed to come up with a rational explanation, rumors began to circulate that a poltergeist was to blame. On the afternoon of August 4th, the city of Beauport ordered an evacuation of the premises to ensure the safety of the occupants. Several of them were convinced that the terrifying manifestations were due to mischievous spirits, otherwise known as poltergeists. For the 4 families involved, the nightmare would soon come to an end.
It was around 10 o'clock. I was half asleep when I heard the noise. I got out of here as fast as I could.
As long as this phenomenon was limited to one wall, public authorities allowed the tenants to stay. But now that more than one wall is affected, they're taking no chances and have ordered the tenants to evacuate. At that point, people were almost panicking. The landlord, the tenants, everybody was scared. Fear set in as to what was going on, and people didn't want to stay there anymore. They didn't even want to spend one more night there.
Later that August, the tenants returned to their apartments to collect their belongings. It seemed that the noises were not as strong and not as frequent as before. By the end of the month, the phenomena seemed to have ended. The spirits had finally left 3566 Monseigneur Gauthier Street once and for all.
I don't believe in this ghost or whatever it is. All I can say is that the house is still standing and that people are living in it.
To my knowledge, it is very feasible that the fact that we had a very, very dry summer in 1989, the Beauport phenomena is something that is very natural to explain, but certainly not supernatural.
When it comes to spiritual manifestations, researchers in the field of parapsychology tend to follow 2 schools of thought. Survivalists believe that poltergeists are disembodied beings, while psilologists think that these strange events are simply unconscious acts attesting to the untapped powers of the mind, as the Philip experiment seems to show. A debate that is both mystic and scientific. The soul versus the mind. Since the beginning of time, humankind has sensed the existence of mysterious forces. For some, these forces express manifestations of the divine. On the contrary, for others, these mysterious powers reveal an unknown aspect of the very nature of man, which can only be perceived using our 6th sense. I'm Kenneth Welsh. Welcome to Northern Mysteries. If we believe what has been written, giant hominoids, half human, half animal, are living, hidden within the vast forests on the west coast of North America, from British Columbia to California. In Canada, this creature is called Sasquatch, a native word that means wild man of the forest. Is there any truth in the legends of these abominable monsters lurking in the woods of North America? Some people are convinced of it.
In the fall of 1941, near the town of Ruby Creek, British Columbia, one of the Chapman children came rushing into the house, saying that a huge cow had just come out of the forest. Instead of a cow, Mrs. Chapman saw a creature that was 3 meters tall, covered in dark-colored fur, heading towards the house. They made their way along the banks of the Fraser River to the town of Ruby Creek. Mr. Chapman got home around 6 o'clock to find the house deserted. A 5-gallon barrel of smoked salmon had been emptied. Near the house, he saw footprints that were 40 centimeters long. Luckily, he found his family safe and sound, walking towards him. The incident drew the attention of Joe Dunn, who was a sheriff in the state of Washington. He was interested in stories about hairy giants. He made drawings and casts of the giant footprints, which would become one of the main sources of physical evidence that Sasquatches do indeed exist. In 1967, Roger Patterson and Bob Gilman took photographs which proved the existence of what natives refer to as the Sasquatch.
The film has been examined by a number of scientists, and they have claimed that this creature is in fact real, right? And then there have been a number of claims otherwise. But all of the work that has been done on it indicates that this was a natural Bigfoot creature.
Bigfoot to some, Sasquatch to others. The myth seems to be based on reality. Although the name of the creature varies, the description given by witnesses is invariably the same, regardless of where it has been seen.
The Sasquatch phenomenon is an intriguing one because they're encountered in just about every province in Canada and virtually every state in the United States. One of the great difficulties with the notion of them being ever present in all these places is the lack of physical evidence that they seem to leave behind.
As a wildlife biologist, I depend on footprints of mammals to determine the presence of mammals in an area. We don't see bears very often. We don't see the smaller mammals because they only come out at night. So we really rely on footprints.
One of the first written accounts comes from explorer David Thompson, who claims to have discovered a series of giant footprints on the snow-covered hills of a glacier near Jasper in 1811. And according to him, they were not made by a black bear or a grizzly. Since then, not all sightings of giant footprints have been worthy of reporting, given that certain pranksters seeking fame and fortune decided to create footprints themselves using giant wooden sculpted feet. Unfortunately for them, casts of the footprints showed a marked difference between a real footprint and a man-made one. Experts claim that the creature would have to weigh about 300 kilograms to leave behind such disturbing footprints.
In many cases, the casts indicate to us and the tracks themselves indicate to us dynamic flexure of a foot. They're also impressed at great depth, much deeper than human beings are capable of doing. You have push-up marks, you have a mid-tarsal break in a lot of the tracks and the casts, which indicate that this wasn't done by a human, because we don't have that kind of mid-tarsal break that occurs in a Sasquatch footprint.
There's a number of features in the plaster cast which show different aspects of the anatomy of the Sasquatch foot. One is the big toe, which is often abducted or divergent. pointing outwards, a very ape-like characteristic. Another in very good cast in fine soil shows fine lines, the actual dermal ridges, which we find in human fingerprints and footprints. And there's a couple other things like a crease across called a flexion crease across the ball of the foot. So these are things which the average person wouldn't know, most zoologists don't know about. So they are in fact very convincing.
Skeptics still abound. They demand more tangible proof than simple casts of giant footprints.
To this point, we don't have any Sasquatch DNA evidence, at least that has been revealed to me.
We have got scat. There are many people that have found it, and it looks like human scat, but it's much larger. Analysis has been done on some of it, and it has been found to contain rodent hairs and rodent parts. It looks like human, but it contains things that humans don't eat.
Dr. Fahrenbach has a number of hair samples that he has obtained from what we might call Sasquatch encounter sites that do not fit into the catalog of any primate hair that we know of so far. This is very promising. It's a first step.
If we were to admit that there are groups of Sasquatches living in the forests of North America, then how could we explain the fact that no corpse has ever been found to date?
We have very acidic soil in the Pacific Northwest, and we have a lot of carrion eaters, everything from small mice to maggots, larger predators such as wolves, coyotes, bears, whatever, that would pick apart a corpse in relatively short time and not leave a trace. I know experienced bear hunters who have never found a bear carcass in 30, 40 years of hunting. But in terms of the death throes of a Sasquatch, we know nothing about that and how they dispose of their remains.
We can't find the Sasquatch because nobody is looking for it. You've flown across Canada, you've looked out the plane, you can see that there's hundreds and thousands of square miles of absolutely nothing down there. There's nobody in there. There's nobody looking. So the first thing is, we're not going to find the Sasquatch until we go out and look, and that means an intense look.
Is the scientific community's lack of interest in the possible existence of Sasquatch due to a lack of hard proof, or simply their own prejudice?
So far, we're still saying things like, no, it must have been an upright bear, a bear standing on its hind legs, or else we fall back on the human hoax thing and dismiss it. I think that's very poor of us, and so I just keep working away. I think it's improving. The subject isn't going away, and my colleagues, some are coming around.
Sasquatch could be a completely new species, and somewhere in between the usual pongid variety and the human variety. I believe sincerely that the Sasquatch is closer to the human variety than it is the pongid, because people have seen the intelligence in its eyes, and almost as if it's a long-lost family member of the Homo sapiens tribe. But again, until you get one, until you capture one or you find one dead, the question begs to be asked.
American scientist Carl Sagan used to say, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof." Unfortunately, proof that the Sasquatch really exists has been flimsy to date. Nothing more than stories that could not be verified and a few footprint casts, but history is full of unexpected twists and turns. Just a century ago, scientists around the world claimed that mountain gorillas were nothing more than a myth. So who knows what the future holds in store? Most researchers studying accounts of Sasquatches believe that they are all that remains of a rare species that is on the verge of extinction. A few investigators even believe that Sasquatches might be aliens. When it comes to strange phenomena, Aliens are often blamed for anything that can't be easily explained. For instance, there are claims that they've been playing mad scientist with our farm animals. Ridiculous, you say? For some, the idea is not so far-fetched.
As she was in the habit of doing, Dorothea Verchomen, a farmer from Leduc, Alberta, drove to the pasture in her pickup truck. One of the heifers was down and looked sick. The awful sight that she beheld left her speechless. The cow was not sick, but dead and mutilated. It had probably been dead for 2 days. Its rectum, vulva, teats, eyes, and ears had been removed. A large area of skin had also been removed around the udder. All of the incisions had been made with surgical precision, and the body showed no signs of having been bitten by a predator. Like all farmers in the area, Mrs. Verchomen had heard stories of animal mutilations, but up until recently she had thought they were nothing more than wives' tales. But now here she was, finding her 4th mutilated animal since April. Dorothea Verchomen was starting to think something was up. Every year, hundreds of cattle are slain in both the United States and Canada. Obviously, a large number of these deaths can be attributed to predators like wolves, coyotes, and even certain birds of prey such as buzzards, but beyond these incidents, there is a whole series of mutilations that are not so easily explained.
Cattle mutilation phenomena is cattle that we find dead, and they seem to die instantly. They never any tracks around, and they take different parts of the body, the tongue, one eye, one ear, not always the same, and there are some cuts in the stomach and the rectum area. They take the genital parts, and a lot of these cuts, they look like laser cut.
Since 1970, during a period of time when I was in the RCMP, I've investigated 2 such incidents of cattle mutilations. They are not unusual. They have occurred during the 70s, 80s, throughout North America. I do know, I've read articles myself where hundreds of animals were found in, PFRAs, grazing leases and things of that nature. It's not unusual.
The phenomenon is not something new. Back in 1967, a slaughtered horse was found in a bush near the Sarcee Native Reserve in Alberta. The following year, other cases were reported in Ontario and Manitoba. In one case, the cattle's genitals, right hind leg, and an ear had been removed. They were very clean cuts, and the animal did not appear to have bled. Later, between August 1st and November 11th, 1979, 38 cases were reported near the border between Alberta and Montana. According to RCMP officers in charge of the investigation, 13 of these cases cannot be explained. Authorities think it might have been the work of a sect.
The involvement of the occult and devil worship has always been linked supposedly to cattle mutilations. Whether or not they are is unknown to me. I have never, during my period of time, investigations that I've been involved in, have ever identified any occult group or devil worship group that actually did or were responsible for the cattle mutilations.
I've had the RCMPs with me only one or two times, and the one of them, I don't think he ever wrote a report on it, but he was quite amazed at what was happening, and he admitted that this was something strange, and sure wasn't predators.
Every year, in all the detachments and the areas I've ever been in, especially in the prairies here where you have PFRAs, which are grazing leases and what have you, there's cattle found all the time that are dead. They die of natural causes. If they're out there too long, well, then you can't determine what the natural cause was. But for sure, if there was an external force, such as a gunshot or trauma of some kind, there'd be evidence of it. If there isn't any evidence of it, either the cow died as a result of disease or some other type of physiological situation, and that can only be determined by science.
With no rational explanation, rumors began to circulate that these barbaric acts were part of experiments being carried out by the military, industrial research groups, or perhaps even a mysterious government agency.
The idea that these are somehow being tested, that these deaths are somehow linked with some sort of military operation seems very bizarre to me. The idea that the military would run around at night, mutilating cattle seems quite extraordinary, and I don't believe it at all.
The government and the oil companies have been blamed for doing some of this, and actually I don't believe this for 1 minute. The oil companies, they claim that they were mutilating cattle so they could find out what the cattle are eating. If they're eating carbon, it's a sign that there's gas and oil below. Well, I have 4 natural gas wells on my ranch, and they've never mutilated a cow to find out I was there. They use seismic.
Since 1980, Canadian police authorities seem to have lost interest in animal mutilations. It seems that some investigations were never even completed.
Let's be honest, a constable going out to do an investigation in a local rural area does his best to identify what took place, and that is to satisfy the complainant, to identify a person who has been involved in a criminal activity, and if that is a criminal activity and there's evidence to support it, to take that person to court and let the courts deal with it. I don't see there be any reason whatsoever why the RCMP or any other government agency would sit back and say, well, there's a cow dead over here, we're going to cover it up. It doesn't make any sense.
In June 2002, Floyd Vetter, a farmer in Veteran, Alberta, discovered that one of his cattle had been mutilated. The entire head of the animal had been skinned, laying bare the skull. The beast had not been touched anywhere else. Oddly enough, the branches in the trees above the carcass were broken, as if the animal had been tossed in the air after it was killed. There were no traces of blood, no traces of any predators. As far as Floyd Vetter was concerned, it was clear that the culprit had come from the sky.
I don't believe that these cattle mutilations are as a result of an extraterrestrial being or anything else. Let's be honest, why would they come down and kill as many cattle and horses and what have you when they can come down, and if they're smart enough to come here, why don't they come in and talk to us? I mean, I don't believe in that at all. I think it's ridiculous.
I've been to over 100 heads so far, and I know what predators can do and what they can't do. And And one of the reasons is also is that we find radiation on some of these animals. And in some cases, the magnetic field will change. In some of these cases, the blood has been turned to hemoglobin. And in order to make hemoglobin in the field, my scientists, I send all my samples to Dr. Levengood in Michigan. And in order to make hemoglobin in the field is like doing brain surgery in the kitchen with kitchen tools. It makes about as much sense. And I have one case where the bones were all darkened, and it's the fat of the animal that was burnt on the bones. I have all those pictures, and that's collagen. And that's the same thing. In order to produce collagen on fat like that, you need microwave heat.
I still do not see a connection with UFOs, but I believe it's an interesting phenomenon that is probably worthy of study, but I would like to see more veterinary pathologists get involved, because at this point most of the people investigating cattle mutilations are UFO researchers without a background in veterinary pathology, and it is those people whose expertise I believe would have the ultimate authority.
In Canada here, I'm the only investigator there is, and I have worked with the RCMP somewhat, and the veterinarians. The veterinarians are very scared to talk about it. In some cases, they refuse to go to the animal.
The cases of animal mutilations are just as disturbing now as they were back in 1967. As long as the only witnesses to these crimes are the cattle who survive, we can only imagine that whoever is doing them has free rein to continue to do so for a long time to come.
To this day, Canada has never led an official investigation into these animal mutilations. However, in the United States, former FBI agent Kenneth Rommel, who headed up an investigation into the matter, produced a report insinuating that observers' beliefs seemed to be directly related to their level of education. His conclusions were not accepted by all. Sometimes prejudices just add further to the mystery.
Since the beginning of time, humankind has sensed the existence of mysterious forces. For some, these forces express manifestations of the divine. On the contrary, for others, these mysterious powers reveal an unknown aspect of the very nature of man, which can only be perceived using our sixth sense.
I'm Kenneth Welsh. Welcome to Northern Mysteries. The small town of Shawville lies an hour west of Ottawa in the county of Pontiac, Quebec. At the end of the 19th century, this community consisted primarily of farmers. One of them, George Dagg, found himself in the middle of a strange experience that more than a century later continues to fuel controversy.
In 1889, the Dagg family lived on a modest farm 7 kilometers away from Shawville. When the manifestations began, there were 6 people living in the house. George Dagg and his wife Susan, their two children, Mary Susan and Johnny, their adopted daughter, Dinah McLean, who was 11 years old, and a young farmhand named Dean. On the morning of September 15th, young Dean found a $5 bill and rushed to give it to George Dagg. George recognized it as the money he had given his wife the night before to put in the dresser drawer for safekeeping. Curious, George went to look in the drawer, and sure enough, the $5 bill was gone. He noticed that a $2 bill was also missing. He went to search Dean's room and soon came across the missing $2 bill. That same day, Susan Dagg found feces in a cubbyhole. Naturally, suspicions fell on poor young Dean. Confronted, the teen denied having stolen the money and insisted that he had nothing to do with the feces. George Dagg didn't believe a word. He decided to bring Dean before the Shawville judge to explain his behavior.
George and Susan Dagg, who were a well-respected, well-accepted farming couple who had two children of their own, and as well they had in the household Dinah, who was an orphan who helped around the farmhouse. And what happened one day suddenly, for no reason anyone could figure out, is we had an outbreak, an infestation of poltergeist-like activity.
While her husband was away, Susan Dagg found more feces, which she was certain was not there only hours before. Although Dean's innocence with regard to the missing money was far from being proven, it was clear that the young farmhand had nothing to do with the appearance of the feces. In the days that followed, furniture began to move by itself. Then the Dagg's adopted daughter, Dinah McLean, was assaulted by a mysterious entity. She screamed out from her room that someone was pulling her hair.
My hair.
The manifestations continued to occur around young Dinah. At night, her bed bounced around. Her covers were pulled down by invisible hands. And she said that she saw a scary dark figure that looked like a human with a head like a cow. Dinah swore that she could hear voices, which no one else could hear.
These occurrences, these violent occurrences, were witnessed by dozens of people from the farming community, friends of the Daggs, the Daggs couldn't benefit from this at all. All this was occurring and everybody was frightened to death of what was going on. They couldn't benefit. There was no financial motive in doing this. In fact, it made them look like fools. So the result of all this activity is it attracted media attention.
Hearing of the case, Percy Woodcock, an Ontario artist and correspondent for the Brockville Recorder and Times, went to Shawville in November to meet the Dagg family.
Percy Woodcock was a lively journalist who was writing for the local newspaper, and here was wonderful copy. It was so wonderful that he could publish it locally in his newspaper and then take it to Montreal and have it published by the Montreal Standard, the leading paper at the time. And indeed, it got reprinted far and wide, and Percy Woodcock was asked to write more stories, so he ended up practically living in the Dagg farmhouse.
Woodcock was skeptical. But one afternoon, young Dinah took him into a shed where she said that she'd heard the ghost. "Are you there, mister?" asked Dinah. To Woodcock's surprise, a guttural voice answered the girl.
"I was watching for you, little Dinah. I am your conscience, third-rate poet, and I will break your neck, cardboard opportunist. Percy Woodcock, you came to flirt with the devil. Do you really think you can make your fortune on the devil's back?"
The ghost spoke, and quite malicious in its conversation, stating that it was the devil and they had to get out of there. But from what I've read and from the documentation is that it quite enjoyed the limelight it was getting.
And it began in a disgruntled voice to explain that it would entertain everybody from the woodshed beginning at dusk the next day.
The next day, shortly after dusk, the Dagg family, along with Percy Woodcock and a few curious townsfolk, gathered in the living room.
"Knock, knock, knock. Hey, hey, hey."
As expected, the entity revealed himself.
"The guest has arrived with a lot of little private secrets on each of you. You do know what I mean, George, and you, Suzanne. I am an angel caring for your shoddy, sanctimonious souls."
He soon changed his story and said that he was the spirit of a man who had died 20 years earlier.
"And I will come once more to pay a final tribute to your children."
It was all so amazing that Percy Woodcock wrote a document on the spot, summarizing the manifestations. Everyone in the room signed the document to validate its authenticity.
The Highland Scots who lived in the community in the Ottawa Valley at Shawville, near Gatineau Park, were probably familiar with ghosts and spirits and perhaps poltergeist-like outbreaks. So there might have been a social expectation of things happening. That's one way of accounting for the fact that a whole group of citizens signed a document attesting to what they had seen.
Finally, apparently growing tired of his antics, the invisible guest took his leave, adding that he would only come back once more to say goodbye to the children. The next day, Dinah came running into the house, both excited and confused. She said that on the way home from school, she had seen an angel who whispered things to her.
"I am your guardian angel, Dinah. Do not be afraid."
Then flew away. The Dagg family didn't experience any more unusual incidents, and no explanation was ever found for the strange manifestations which took place at the Dagg family farm. In 1957, the National Film Board of Canada produced a short film on the Dagg poltergeist called The Ghost That Talked. At the time, no one had a rational explanation for what had happened. Today, 50 years later, the mystery surrounding those strange manifestations still remains. Experts believe that poltergeists, or knocking spirits, as was the case for the Dagg family, are troubled souls that are desperately trying to contact living souls, as if they have a final message to pass on. Acton Vale, January 1969. That night, Father Claude Léveillé went to visit the St. Onge family. Father Léveillé had barely gotten through the door when Mr. St. Onge ushered him off to one of the bedrooms on the second floor. The clergyman was stunned as he stepped into the doorway. Objects in the room seemed to be animated as though by an invisible evil force. An iron bed was bouncing around on the floor. But what caught Father Léveillé's attention the most were the blankets on the other bed. which were constantly being pulled up and down. Feeling the presence of evil in the room, Father Levier took out a vial of holy water and blessed the room. "What do you think, Father?" asked Mr. St. Onge. "I think we need to pray. A lot." An invisible guest appeared to be staying at the St. Onge house. The St. Onge family was going about its normal activities that cold January day. No one suspected that their house was about to become the stage for disturbing occurrences.
There were quite a few happenings in the St. Onge house in Actonville in 1969. I'd been a parish priest there for about a year and a half. What happened was, we got calls at the rectory 3 evenings in a row. A priest went to the St. Onge family home to ascertain, along with some other people, that the furniture was effectively moving by itself. Bed sheets were moving around. Wardrobes were emptying themselves. There was a framed picture of Our Lady of Perpetual Help that went hang gliding and was flopping about. Lots of things of that nature.
It all began at 7 p.m. that night. In the kitchen, a picture of Our Lady of Perpetual Help came off the wall without breaking. In the bedrooms, something intangible emptied the dresser drawers and tore the bedding off the mattresses. Evil forces were also at work in the living room, as furniture began to move without anyone touching it. In less than an hour, the house looked like a battlefield. Not knowing what to do, Mr. St. Onge decided to phone the church.
The St. Onge family were all regular churchgoers, particularly Mr. St. Onge himself. He was in charge of the cemetery. He was the one who dug the graves. Also, he was often a choir master at the morning mass in church.
Father Wilfred Bérard answered Mr. St. Onge's call that night. At first, it all seemed too bizarre to be true, but the young priest decided to go and visit the house to see exactly what was happening. Father Bérard was amazed at what he saw when he arrived. Cupboard doors were opening and closing by themselves in the kitchen. The St. Onges told them that these strange things had been happening for more than an hour, and they didn't know why. Throughout the evening, Father Bérard witnessed many equally disconcerting incidents. Then, suddenly at 10 p.m., the manifestations stopped. Father Bérard left with no idea that the nightmare would start up again the next day. Just like the day before, odd things began to happen at 7 p.m. Guylaine was in the kitchen, studying her catechism, when suddenly, the picture of Our Lady of Perpetual Help came off the wall. Guylaine screamed in fright.
Madame St. Onge!
Clearly, the St. Onge family was cursed. This time, Father Leveillé was called in to tackle the problem.
Madame St. Onge!
C'est là que j'ai été témoin de cette...
I was a witness to a few of these happenings. A clothes brush with a slightly rounded handle was balancing upright on a towel rack.
Sur une tige de... où l'on met des serviettes.
It would have taken at least 5 minutes to get it to balance like that. And this just happened instantaneously.
C'était fait instantanément.
As the evening went on, Father Leveillé noticed that the phenomena seemed to be linked to young Guylaine.
Guylaine, c'était une jeune...
Guylaine was a young girl. She was in elementary school.
qui devait avoir...
She was about, I don't remember her exact age. She must have been 7 or 8 years old. She was looked after by the St. Onge family because her parents worked long hours. They wanted Guylaine to be well supervised by a family who would see to it that her homework was done and so on. So that's why she was with the St. Onge family.
Father Leveillé noticed that the disturbances seemed to get worse when Guylaine was studying her catechism. He had seen enough to know that he was dealing with the forces of evil.
J'en ai déduit ça, moi.
I deduced that since it was triggered by prayer, the evil spirit must be behind it.
That same evening, they heard a loud noise coming from upstairs. The St. Onges ran up to find that a small table had been overturned. While they were setting the table back on its feet, the blankets from one of the beds were tossed onto the floor. As soon as 10 p.m. struck, the manifestation stopped, just as they had the night before.
The third night, I was on duty at the office. I took the call, and Mr. St. Onge, as he had done the previous nights, tells me on the phone, "Get over here at once, the devil's on the loose."
Father Bernier went to the St. Onges house with 2 other priests. He also witnessed the inexplicable movement of the picture of Our Lady of Perpetual Help.
What struck me the most was that at a certain point, the picture moved across the room. It sort of glided in the air. Then it went and hung itself on the living room doorknob. So then I said, I think we have a problem. Sometimes it landed on the side, and then it would move again. At one point, Mrs. St. Onge got sick and tired of running after it and hanging it back on the wall, so she stuck it behind a chair. She pushed the chair against the wall, and the picture started to jump around behind the chair. The other thing that really struck me was that at one point, when we were sitting in the living room, we heard a noise sort of like tap dancing. It was coming from the kitchen. We went there and we had a look. The table and all the chairs were dancing up and down. A real tap dance number.
Unlike his colleagues, Father Bernier had had scientific training. To him, these types of manifestations were born of superstitious belief or fraud. He was confident that he would find a rational explanation for the occurrences.
There were these brushes that were hanging on the wall. They had wooden handles and wooden tops. These brushes started beating against the wall. They were beating quite heavily. We went to have a look. It went on for a while. Then the brushes stopped. When we went out of the bathroom, we said, okay, now it's finally over. But just at that moment, all the things that were on the shelves in the bathroom started moving as if they were following us. And then they fell to the ground. There was also a small, low square table besides the bathtub. The table jumped into the tub. We couldn't make heads or tails of it.
The only thing that Father Bernier and the others found was that the manifestations took place between 7 and 10 p.m. And they always seemed to happen around young Guylaine.
We noticed that as soon as Guylaine started studying her catechism, it set something off. Whether it was a coincidence or whatever, I haven't the foggiest idea. But we noticed it did happen on a few occasions.
Poltergeist, by tradition, it's a noisy, knocking spirit by definition. But more likely these days, the theory is that it's coming more and more from adolescent girls who are going through such a change, either physically and mentally, that it's coming. It's actually, the term has been coined, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, and it's a mind over matter type of situation. And what a lot of people are calling it is it's a mental temper tantrum. So, like, if you get mad, you're more likely to lash out and hit a wall. Well, some people are more likely to, or in this case, with the poltergeist phenomena, likely to lash out with their mind instead of physically.
To see if there was a link between Guylaine and the manifestations, the priests suggested to Guylaine that she say a prayer.
We asked her to say the prayer she'd learned in her catechism in 6th grade. With Jesus in my heart, I'm not afraid. She started praying, and right at that moment, when she was saying the prayer, the racket started.
The rosary that Guylaine was holding was literally torn from her hands. The incident convinced Father Léveillé even further that the manifestations were the work of the devil.
She had been staying with people who were very devout and who were regular churchgoers, and her parents were not. I didn't know them. This could trigger a conflict within her.
The manifestations stopped at 10 p.m., just as they had the previous 2 nights. The only difference was that this time they seemed to have stopped for good. The St. Ange family didn't report any further strange phenomena. For Father Normand Bernier, these manifestations were to remain an enigma.
When the dining room table and the chairs started dancing, there were 6 of us in the living room. There was no one in the kitchen. We headed to the kitchen and we saw for ourselves. I just can't imagine how we could have been duped. You would have needed a setup that would have been impossible to conceal.
Beyond these findings, there is no other explanation for the phenomena observed at the St. Ange's house those 3 nights in January 1969. Why just 3 nights? And why always between 7 and 10 p.m.? As if these strange happenings weren't enough in themselves, they had to have these particularities.
The study of strange phenomena forces us to examine our beliefs and prejudices. Obviously, it would be much simpler to just ignore them and play ostrich. But is that really the best approach? After all, isn't the human experience connected to our understanding of the universe? And doesn't questioning lead to the discovery of knowledge?
When the unknown shakes a person's confidence, their imagination can run wild. But true mysteries that defy all explanation may be doorways to the fantastic realm of knowledge.
I'm Kenneth Welsh. Don't miss this Northern Mystery. For many of us, archaeology is synonymous with adventure. It conjures up images of Indiana Jones fighting to save one of the greatest treasures in history. But that's just Hollywood fiction. Or is it? A British man was the source of inspiration for this imaginary hero, and his adopted Franco-Ontarian daughter may have made the most important discovery of all time. On January 1st, 1925, there was a flurry of activity at the top of the Grand Temple of Lubantum. The Mayan city discovered a few months earlier by British adventurer Frederick Mitchell Hedges. This was no ordinary day. A week earlier, Mitchell Hedges' adopted daughter Anna had noticed a bright shining object below the temple stones as she gazed at a crack at the bottom of a well. And she was the only one small enough to fit into the opening at the top of the temple. This descent to the bottom of the well was her birthday present.
After grabbing the shiny object at the bottom of the well, Anna was pulled back up. Everyone was stunned by the beautiful and mysterious artifact that she held. In a theatrical gesture, the adventurer raised it above his head to show it to all of the workers gathered at the base of the temple. In unison, 4 words rose in a clamor: Las Caballeras de Cristal, the Crystal Skull. Professor, archaeologist, and adventurer, Frederick Albert Mitchell Hedges is without a doubt one of the most amazing people of his generation. He was the inspiration for Steven Spielberg's famous character, Indiana Jones. Frederick Mitchell Hedges was a man for all seasons: antique collector, explorer, archaeologist, lecturer, author, and poet. When he was 16, his father, John Hedges, signed him up with a team of prospectors about to leave for the Arctic. His father was hoping this would discourage his son from his interest in adventure, but instead, the opposite happened. On the icy tundra of the Arctic, Frederick Mitchell Hedges discovered a true passion for exploring unknown parts of the world. Frederick Mitchell Hedges' fascination with native tribes and the respect with which he treated them gained him quite a reputation. His journal proved to be one of the first ethnological studies into these indigenous people. Some people's lives read like a novel. Such was the case for Anne-Marie de Guillon, a young Franco-Ontarian orphan who was adopted by Frederick Mitchell Hedges in 1917. She found herself catapulted into a whole new world. In 1920, accompanied by his friend, Lady Richmond Brown, Frederick Mitchell Hedges set out to explore the virgin forests of Central America. They had heard of tribes that had never been discovered, living hidden on the edges of civilized society. That was all it took to pique the explorer's curiosity. After many mishaps, from an encounter with crocodiles along the Rio Grande to malaria, 4 years later, Mitchell Hedges finally arrived at the sizable ruins of Lubantum, a Mayan city built 1,000 years earlier. It was in the heart of the city's grand temple that his daughter Anna discovered the most puzzling artifact from pre-Columbian civilizations.
I was not supposed to go on the building at all, any building in Lubantum, because I could have had an accident, and my father was very protective of me. But I heard 2 of the Maya people say, if you go on top of that building, you can see for miles and miles, and the curiosity was a bit too strong. So one day I went on top, and we standing there looking at the scenery miles away, but all of a sudden a light came to my face from the skull, which was inside a building. And I got very excited. I went and told my father about it, but of course he gave me a good telling off that I had no right to go up there. He was responsible for me and all that sort of thing. But I did. But that curiosity, he said, I'm going to find out what's there. I was chosen to go down. You saw it, you go down. I said, no, I don't want to go down there. There's snakes, there's all sorts of things there. I'm not going down. He said, well, you saw it. Whatever's there, you'll bring up. And he was very determined about that.
The opening of the well was clear enough. Today was Anna's birthday. She was turning 17. Mitchell-Hedges decided to mark the occasion by allowing his daughter to go down and retrieve her discovery.
And he tied me with a rope, and two men let me down. And now all I saw was a light again, and I picked it up quick and put it in my shirt and tied my shirt and brought it out.
And she found it, brought it out, and all the natives, when they first saw this, went berserk. They thought that this was a God-given gift to them.
All eyes were riveted on the gem that she was holding preciously. It was a life-size human skull made from a block of quartz crystal. Frederick Mitchell-Hedges had never seen anything like it.
Nobody knew what it was or where it came from when they first discovered it, except that it's an incredibly beautiful artifact. And the top half was found first, and then the lower jaw was found a little bit later.
One day, a little boy, how he got in the building where the skull was, we don't know. And he brought the jaw of the skull, which I didn't pick up because I was so frightened.
The most puzzling archaeological artifact ever discovered, photographed, and studied from all angles and under different lighting, still kept its mystery locked inside.
I think the real secret of the skull in the crystal itself is the healing purpose. It healed a lot of people. It made their life more livable and joyful. The skull's got to know that you believe in it and you will trust it.
The artifact was made some 17,000 years ago to serve as a receptacle for spiritual and universal knowledge. What was it for? Why did the Mayan artisans make it so lifelike, when most of their art was more abstract? When was it created? And why was it made of crystal? Since the invention of electronics and computers in particular, we know that crystal can be used for storing information. For those on the esoteric path, the choice of crystal by Mayan artisans had a lot more to do with its memory capacity than its aesthetic aspect. To them, the crystal skull was a sort of hard drive where ancient civilizations stored extraordinary knowledge. But if the crystal skull was what mystics said it was, what was the secret to accessing this ancient knowledge? That's where Carol Davis comes in. In the early 80s, Carol Davis joined a friend who was visiting Anna Mitchell-Hedges in Kitchener, Ontario. At the time, Carol Davis was already known as one of the most extraordinary psychics in Canada. She only had a passing interest in archaeology and ancient civilizations. As soon as the psychic gazed into the eyes of the skull, her senses began to reel. For 2 hours, she was plunged into a deep trance, communicating directly with the spirit of the skull. It was the first of many sessions in which she channeled the ancient wisdom held within the skull.
Carol Davis was and still is a trance medium, respected and internationally known. She had met the crystal skull before I met Carol Davis. And she had psychometrized the skull and had done sessions with it with the owner, Sammy Mitchell-Hedges.
According to legend, there are 13 crystal skulls which hold the secrets of the universe. Descendants of the Mayans believe that when all 13 skulls are found and brought together, they will reveal their secrets. Up to now, 6 of the skulls have been discovered. The circumstances surrounding their discovery remain unclear. But the one found by Anna Mitchell Hedges was of such superior craftsmanship compared to the others that people thought for a long time that it was a modern work of art, a fake planted inside the Grand Temple of Lubantum. But a study conducted in the 1990s by the British Museum seems to indicate the opposite. The skull was supposedly created by a super civilization and then entrusted to guardians for safekeeping. These guardians, possibly survivors of the legendary Atlantis, were said to have brought the skull to Central America as a gift for Mayan priests. The crystal skull remains one of the greatest mysteries of humanity. The Mayans believed that its reflections would someday reveal the secrets of the universe.
To me, the mystery of the crystal skull is taken to the crystal skull by the observer, by anybody who goes to it. Whatever thoughts they have in their mind, it's like the silver chalice. It's like any other icon. People take to the icon what they want to believe, and they get from it what they want to receive.
History is a curious mix of knowledge and ignorance, and rarely is anything 100% certain. It's this ambiguity that makes history so fascinating. Unlike most sciences, when it comes to history, we should bear in mind what Albert Einstein once said: imagination is more important than knowledge. Criminal investigations, biographical enigmas, archaeological digs. History is teeming with gray areas, uncertainties which sometimes lead to the wildest speculations. It's up to the historians to draw the line between what is improbable and what is likely. For an historian from Quebec City, one of the greatest mysteries in the history of New France was the location of the grave of Samuel de Champlain. Something was happening under the bell tower of the Quebec City Basilica. A few light bulbs placed here and there lent an eerie feeling to the atmosphere. Workers wore masks to protect themselves from the foul air. With the utmost caution, the men slipped cables under the bronze coffin. Once this was done, the four men lifted the precious coffin in unison, as delicately as possible. The moment of truth had arrived. Without any further ado, one of the workers began prying off the lead hinge holding the cover in place. As the work progressed, everyone was wondering the same thing. Had they found the treasure they had been seeking so long? Finally, the cover slid off the coffin and the remains appeared to be well preserved. Could these be the sought-after remains of Samuel de Champlain, explorer and founder of Quebec City? The search for the grave of Samuel de Champlain, the first Governor-General of New France, has become synonymous with the project's primary supporter, René Lévesque. Born in Quebec City in 1925, this son of a businessman developed an avid interest in Champlain's story early on in his life.
I remember there was a French celebration going on. A certain Mr. Leblanc was speaking very enthusiastically about Champlain. He was a very interesting man. We were instantly drawn in by what he had to say. We were all riveted. And at the end, he said that Champlain had died in 1635, and that he was supposedly buried right over there. And he opened his arms like this, facing an area bordered by Du Trésor, Dufort, Sainte-Anne, and Buade streets. And he said, underneath this terrace lies Fort Saint-Louis, built by Champlain himself. That was enough for me to fall under Champlain's spell.
For young René Lévesque, the quest had just begun. Starting the next day, the teen began hanging out below Dufferin Terrace. As he walked along the city walls of Old Quebec, he could practically feel the presence of the founder of Quebec City. This quest was somewhat mystical in nature for him.
Samuel Champlain was named cartographer to the king, or as he was actually called, the royal geographer. This is how Champlain came to be aboard the Bonne Renommée, which set off for the first time from Honfleur in 1603. We know that he landed in Tadoussac and that he was the first one to pick out the site of Quebec City. It seems that in Algonquin the word Quebec means a narrows, and this is exactly what drew Champlain to this spot. He said that there were cliffs there that would protect against enemies and also against the wind. He also said that the river was narrower at this point and that the water was very deep. So he thought he should build a port there, which could accommodate larger vessels.
Samuel de Champlain established the city of Quebec in 1608, and King Henry V appointed him as the country's first governor-general. Champlain's generosity, as well as his great sense of honor and justice, earned him the respect of native communities. He spent all of his time on North American soil, attempting to merge old and new world views.
Champlain was about 70 years old when he died. He had been paralyzed for several months. He was staying in Fort Saint-Louis in his room, a very small room. Nonetheless, he could still write. The handwriting in his will is clearly his own. It's shaky, but it's undeniably his. He died on Christmas Day. On Christmas Eve, actually. This spelled catastrophe for the country now bereft of its founding father. They held a very lovely religious ceremony for him, an outdoor procession on Buade Street or thereabouts, going to the parish church, Notre-Dame de la Recouvrance, over there where the Château Frontenac stands today.
At the time, not much was known about the burial site of Samuel de Champlain. Historians found a clue in Charles Huot de Montmagny's personal diary. He was the second Governor-General of New France and the man responsible for Champlain's burial. Montmagny wrote that his predecessor's body was placed in the Champlain Chapel alongside his friends, Father Charles Rimbaud and Mr. François de Ray. But where exactly was the Champlain Chapel? That was the key to solving the mystery. Around 1950, the discovery of 2 scrolls revived interest in Champlain's grave. These documents pointed to 2 plots of land in the heart of Old Quebec. Historians had a pretty good idea where the properties were located. Armed with this new knowledge, Silvio Dumas, considered to be the father of Quebec archaeology, set out to find the remains. Among the young excavators was René Lévesque, who was naturally anxious to lend a hand. The excavators dug up vestiges of a low wall, but nothing indicated that they were close to finding the mysterious Champlain Chapel. They were back to square one.
In his manuscripts, we discovered that O'Leary had already searched that area and found nothing. So René Lévesque told us to dig deeper. And finally, we found this little alcove, which was very interesting, and it was full. All the sites had already been dug up except for this one, so that's where we started to dig. When we finally discovered the tomb, that's when we began asking ourselves, could this possibly be the place where Champlain was buried? There were bones, lots of them, human bones, because a trench had already been dug for some wires or pipes, and that had disrupted several burial vaults, so we were obviously in the right spot. We found a coin with the year 1636 on it right from the start. This was really a promising development.
Unfortunately for René Lévesque and his team, the remains they found were not those of Champlain, but rather a member of the clergy. The browned skin, which was like poorly tanned leather, gave the body the appearance of a mummy. The body was dressed in ceremonial garb, a colored cassock adorned with a gold cross. The corpse seemed to be staring at the intruders who had rudely disturbed him from his slumber.
Father Higgins was a Jesuit. He was a Jesuit priest from Belgium who died in 1879.
Once again, the body of Samuel de Champlain had eluded its pursuers. But for how long? René Lévesque recently came across a scroll in Quebec City's archives that might point the way to Champlain's grave, just in time for Quebec City's 400th anniversary.
So Champlain was a role model, someone to help enlighten today's Quebecers and get them to rediscover their roots, be they French, Christian, or Native.
In their search for the truth, historians, like police officers, must not dismiss any clue. Through perseverance and determination, historians reveal secrets where everything had once seemed cut and dried. Without this scrupulous effort, history would read like a boring novel.
Since time began, we have sensed the existence of mysterious forces, divine powers, or unknown aspects of human nature. Maybe our sixth sense can whisper the answer.